Welcome everyone to the Educator Collaborative Gathering in spring of 2021. I am here with amazing author, illustrator, community organizers, all together in the struggle, literature, teaching practices, and community partnerships on resistance and healing. So welcome, we are excited to have you. We're gonna get right to it. So you get to learn a little bit more about Alejandría Fights Back, La Lucha de Alejandría, and about all our amazing panelist speakers today. So we'll start first with a little bit of context. And we have here author Leticia Hernández to start us off.
Oh, I thought it was going to be Rob.
Typical me. Yes, I don't have any of the, all right, I type all this stuff up, but never look at it afterwards. Okay, here we go. All right, so we're going to start off with our illustrator, Rob Liu-Trujillo, who's going to tell us a little bit about the book.
What's up, everybody? So Alejandría Fights Back is a really awesome bilingual picture book that's about a girl who is facing some displacement in her neighborhood, in her building, and where she lives in her barrio. And she decides to fight back and to not just take it and to be displaced or kicked out of where she's from. She gets together with her community and rallies her community and her family to really challenge, what so many people across the world are facing today. And it is a really uplifting story.
So excited for everyone to get their hands on this book. So we have also here our author, Leticia Hernández-Linares. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of how this story came about?
Well, thanks for having this gathering. It's so exciting. I can't wait for this book to come out just in time before my youngest son graduates from elementary school. So it's been a big dream of mine. And this book is inspired in part by his activism and his love for our neighborhood. I think before we talk about the story itself, I'd love to ask you, Mike, to talk about the project that frames this book, because it's one of several strategies in this national project. So how did this all start, Mike?
Man, it feels like it was forever ago. It was a couple years ago. So my name is Mike Leyba. I work with an organization called City Life Vida Urbana, based in Boston. And I'm a community organizer that organizes around housing justice in Boston. And I'm part of this larger kind of cohort of similar organizations that are all doing housing justice work around the country. And we're calling ourselves the Rise Home Stories Project. It's kind of this really unique collaboration between organizers like me and storytellers and artists. And all of us are looking at how to tell stories about housing, land, racial justice in the US, and how we can use stories to actually reimagine the past, present, and future of our communities. So we started working on a suite of projects, 5 different projects in 2018, and it's taken a couple of years to get to the point where we finally have a hard copy book in my hands. So it feels really, really good. And Alejandría Fights Back is actually the first project that's on its way. But really, the idea for Alejandría came from a renter assembly that we had in Atlanta a number of years ago. My organization is part of this coalition called Right to the City. And we had an assembly of folks in Atlanta, and we just had some tables. And one of the creative activities that we did was like, what kind of stories should we be telling? and people had the idea of, why don't we do a children's book? The original idea was to do a spoof children's book. But we kind of took that idea and we ran with it, and actually, out of all of years of work, it's really transformed into this really beautiful story. And Leticia has been really, really, really driving that kind of creative, that storyteller voice and that narrative. And it was a real honor to be able to collaborate with Leticia. And especially somebody who loves their craft and loves writing as much as she does. Um, but I guess I'm actually curious, Leticia, about when did you fall in love with writing, and how did you kind of come into collaboration with the project?
What oh, that's one of those questions where you're like, where do I begin? No, thanks for all of that context and just sort of situating us in this amazing project that I'm just so grateful to have been part of. When did I fall in love with writing? It was pretty aligned with when I started reading. Like I started devouring books, and I grew up pretty fluent in both in Spanish because my parents were just learning English when I was, when I was born, and so I used to like to write in Spanish as a way to sort of practice it because most of my family was still in El Salvador and mostly resided in El Salvador when I was growing up. And then I started to just fall in love with books, and so that led to falling in love with storytelling and wanting to tell my own stories, totally unaware that all the books I was reading I was completely like missing in, right? When I look at the books that my kids are reading now, and even movies, right, it's just such a different experience. And that's that we haven't gotten there yet, right? But things have improved. So yeah, I think it was just partly loving literature, loving stories. And that's how I was taught about El Salvador, as my father told these really tremendously vivid stories. He's an artist too, a musician. And he told me about back home in a way that I felt like really connected to it. But there were no books for it. So later that love of writing became about writing myself and my community into existence, you know?
I mean, in a lot of ways, there's a huge connection between that feeling validated and seen and like you exist. I mean, real estate and housing. There's so many parallels. A lot of how gentrification happens is by completely erasing the people that were there before. Not only erasing them, waiting for the memory to fade, and then moving forward with a totally new, different thing. And so part of the power of telling our stories is really not forgetting, and not letting that happen, not letting our people be erased in so many ways. Anyway, sorry, that was such a profound thought. I'm still digesting it. It's a nugget of wisdom. Anyway, but when you started working with the team, what, in 2018 or 2019, maybe just talk a little bit about what it was like working on this project or with the team.
Yeah, so we, yeah, it was 2019. I'm trying to think, like time has shifted so much because of COVID, right? But the funny thing is that because we're national, we were already sort of relating to each other virtually. So that wasn't a big change, right? But we got together in person in October and did some relationship building and some visioning, which are two key parts of everything that I do. And so getting to know this like really awesome group of people was exciting and just part of how I ideate. So that was really natural. And, I've done a lot of collaborative work. So the idea of, working with, well, be accountable to a diverse group of stakeholders wasn't new. And yet I hadn't quite written that way. I had done other kinds of collaboration. So it was still a growth and a stretch, and positive, I mean, people were really gracious and creative and gave me lots of ideas that then I had to go back. And so I wrote, I think it was about 4 drafts, and there was a lot of feedback, right? There was official editors, there was the illustrator, there was the group, and then we extended it to community and youth. And that was really wonderful. It was really humbling and I've always believed in what Roque Dalton used to espouse in his poetry, that poetry like bread is for everyone, and that my veins don't end in me, but in the blood of the community, right? And so that is something that I really live my artistic and, educator and activist life by. So this was a real test. It was like, all right, this is what you say you're about. So let's see what it looks like in this form. And I think we did some pretty groundbreaking work. And then the connection between the different projects, which we're going to learn more about as the sort of distribution and publicity, right, will be really exciting, so that I can even learn more of what I'm part of, right? It's just one piece of the narrative. Yeah. And maybe it would be great to hear maybe a little bit of like a preview of what that's going to look like, because I know that you know a little bit about several of the projects, right?
Yeah, there's a ton. There's 5 projects, everything from a podcast to a video game to this children's book. I'm also working on a project that's an animated web series. So we're going to be telling a whole bunch of different stories in a whole lot of different mediums, and all with the intention of building our community power and reimagining new futures and combating some of the really harmful stories that we hear constantly.
So Rob, you want to jump in and talk about the illustration process and just your experience with this project?
Yes, thank you. I was like, when do I start? Yeah, so typically when I work on a children's book, the first thing I get to see is the manuscript. So a writer has already written the story, whether it just be a synopsis or an entire manuscript, and I get to look at that and think about it and imagine it and say, "Ooh, this is good. I want to do this," or "Hell no, I ain't doing this." And for this particular story, when it started, I was like, "Oh yeah, this is definitely something I want to work on." And typically what I do is I'll print it out and I'll just make a lot of little notes and little doodles and little drawings on the manuscript itself. And then for this case, because it was so collaborative with all of us, we got a chance to like meet face to face, talk about it, really just explore like the genesis of the ideas, how they came about, and what we all envisioned for the story to be. And that gave me a lot of ideas to not only think of what the story is going to look like, but to really think about the characters and how they would look. So one of the first things I did was make a bunch of character designs where I imagined how the main character Alejandra would look, how her mommy would look, how Abuela would look, or Tita as we call her in the story, and just kind of share those with the group and say, what do you think? And then from there, starting to get into thumbnails, which are basically like little tiny drawings or little versions of the story. And then taking the feedback from everyone, because every single time we did something with the writing or the art, like Leticia said, there was lots of feedback. Take that and make what they call a dummy or drawing spreads, where I take every single scene and try to draw it to the best of my ability and then present that to the group. And then there were several rounds of that, of saying, here's what I think. And then people saying, it'd be great if you had this, or that's really good, could you add this, or that's not necessary for the story, take that out. And that back and forth is a really cool process, because my artwork and Leticia's writing is very much in service of this story and of this narrative. And so it's a humbling experience to be like, no, it's just the way I want it to look. Like this is my stuff, but it's like really what's going to be the best for this story and what's going to be the best for readers who are going to pick it up and want to get into it. So after doing several rounds of drawings for the spreads and what we call the dummy, where you take all of the drawings of the book together, then presenting that to the team and saying, here's how I imagine the color to look, what the streets look like, if someone's holding a horchata, what that looks like, what color is her shirt, all of those different things. And then getting feedback again, saying, how do people feel about this? And then once all of that is done and everybody is good with it, then I move on to painting it. And that part is usually the fastest, actually. All the other stuff takes a lot longer, but the painting is usually pretty quick. And then, a couple of adjustments or edits or last few things that people want to add on or change, and then moving on to the cover and making sure that the cover really pulls you in and makes you want to know more. Not telling you everything that happens, but you look at the cover and you wonder, like, why are they all holding signs, first of all, and why is she at a podium? And hopefully it's posing more of a question than telling you the whole story. So that's pretty much how it comes about. And then I would say it doesn't stop there, because then people, readers, teachers, educators, so many different people young people, children, families, they project their own experiences and feelings and things that they see that you may not have even thought of, and they bring it back to you. So it's kind of like an ongoing process once the story is out there. But that's in general how the illustration part works.
And what was most challenging in this process for you? And was that challenge similar to other projects that you've been on?
Well, in general, I usually just have one art director and one author to work with. And in this case, we had the whole Rise Home Stories project, and then the constituency of people as well. So that was challenging, but challenging in a good way, because, you know, I've worked at a nonprofit before. I'm aware of, like, you know, the youth leaders, the elders, all the different community members, and it takes hella long to come up with the decision. But it's a much better and more meaningful decision when you got all these people, you know, really putting you up on game and saying, this is how it should be. So it was challenging, but I really appreciate it. So yeah, that's the most challenging part.
I think
All
it's,
right.
sorry,
Go
I
ahead.
was just gonna talk a little bit about the community connections and kind of, you know, we have a really beautiful story. We have really beautiful illustrations, and I think it's worth kind of saying why we undertook this like really important project, and what we're trying to accomplish with Alejandro Fights Back and with the other projects really is it's a big shift. It's a shift in narrative and in culture, and culture is so important, and also it can be very invisible if we're not paying close attention to it, you know. I always kind of think about it as culture is the air we breathe, it's the water we drink, it's kind of around us in every interaction, every ad we read, and every dream of a better future. I think it's really relational, and it allows us to like see or not see the links between things. It can help us or it can hinder us from making sense of people's actions in the world around us. It's kind of like, you know, in our organizing work, I always view culture as like a compass for seeing what the terrain that we're like actually working on is, as well as like how do we plant seeds for a future we want to live in, you know. And culture is like so core to our organizing work. In my org, you know, we're a community organizing group. We're in Boston. It's, you know, relatively small city compared to other big cities in the U.S. We hold weekly meetings in English and Spanish for people who are being threatened by displacement in a whole lot of different ways. We typically have between 90 and 120 people come to these meetings weekly. And one of the first things that they're asked to do is tell their story. And as part of this process, they kind of discover that they're in a room full of people who have either been in a similar position or have committed to support them. Dominant culture, if we're not careful, can just tell them to blame themselves and to be ashamed and to not bother. Just move, just be done with it, you know. And we really intentionally try to create a culture of speaking their truth, of creating space for them to speak their truth, to find solidarity with each other, and to advocate for big systemic solutions. And that kind of shift in what the narrative is really has profound implications on how people view their ability to impact change, or to, you know, to resist for the sake of a just transition and justice. And of course, like during COVID, you know, we've seen kind of inequity layered on top of inequity. And during moments of crisis, one thing that I've learned this year or last year, 2020, is that when you're really confronted with a crisis, you go back to the stories and the frames that you know. And if all of our stories are talking about scarcity or blame or individualism or kind of like the inevitability of like market forces and gentrification and all that stuff, if we really like just succumb to that, then that's really our loss, and it will have, it will have impacts on our communities and our cities for decades. So that's like the why. The why is like, it's a really big shift, and it's really important to like um to put out stories about agency and young people taking action. One of the most interesting conversations we had in this whole process was around who was the protagonist and who was the antagonist. And like, I'm not going to spoil anything, but like, some of like, it
Don't give it away, Mike.
I know it's so hard, but I will say, like, there's just not enough stories in culture where young folks really are, leading the charge in a way that adults can't or have conditioned themselves not to. And so yeah, I hope I didn't give away too much, but that is super important, just especially during COVID. We can't default to those same harmful narratives, which is why I'm really excited that this story is going to get out there, and it's going to be out in the world, and I'm really grateful for teachers who have such an important role of bringing this to the world and creating, filling in some of the gaps and creating a whole curriculum around it.
And right before we go into that, thanks so much, Mike, for sharing that. I was just thinking, before we go into the ways that teachers, librarians, and all of us can just use this book and share it, I was reminded of what you were sharing earlier, Leticia, and just wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about what informed your own revision process as a writer, as you were going back with the team, like what informed the development of these characters, bringing in the reality of and the weight of this issue, right, in their lives. Just because I have a lot of teachers who'll say like, oh, this is a really tough topic and I don't know how to approach it with students. And then I'll come with like books. I'm like, well, this author, this illustrator, both of them, they'll really help you. They're like your co-teachers in the classroom. And that's why I'm a big advocate of finding and being really intentional with books and finding great literature, because then these books are my co-teachers in the classroom. So if you could talk a little bit about that process of weaving in this really tough issue that's a reality in so many children's lives, and how you were able to develop that in the story.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Carla. I've had a long journey with this issue because I live in the Mission District of San Francisco, and I've lived here since the mid-90s. So when I came to live close to some family that was here, it was the first, not the first, but what they called the dot-com boom that, kind of faded somewhat quickly compared to what we're going through now. So a lot of my community work and creative work was around this topic, right? And it just got a lot more accelerated more recently during this tech, whatever you call it. And so I have done a lot of interdisciplinary projects around it and supported and, got out into the streets to protest for community members that were dealing with things and all of that throughout the years, and never thought it was going to hit me. And in the middle of a project that I was doing around community spaces that had been displaced, it was like a photo poem series, I received an eviction notice. So that sort of turned the project into writing about that experience. And thankfully, with the help of resources, the Tenderloin Community Housing Clinic, we were able to beat it. But I was, what Mike was saying, that was me. I was the person who was like, who am I to think that we're gonna beat it? And, I just went into immediate mourning because this is the longest place I've ever lived in my life, on the same block. And my kids get to walk to school, and I had to face questions like, well, mommy, where are we gonna move? And I had no answers to that, and exchanging with other mothers who've gone through similar things or who have received those notices, and how frightening it is. And then even more frightening to fight it, the actual, like the decision, no matter how against the man you are, like when it comes to really standing up to one, it's terrifying. And so, but we did it with a lot of support. So that was partly because I had to navigate that personally and not, do I shield my kids from this? Do I not? My oldest was in middle school. My youngest was too little to understand. So I was honest with the middle school kid. I kind of just gave certain pieces to the younger kid so he was a little older. And then, so I mean, that was part of it, is that I had to, in real time, kind of like figure out what scaffolds to put in for my kids and what to share with them. I mean, and what I've learned is sort of having to undo some of the things that my teenage parents did, is that sheltering doesn't really work, I mean, and I think at this point, when my son had to go through that in middle school, that whole process of being afraid of like losing his school and his community, it's kind of the como dicen, I'm really bad at saying something is up, but it's like, all bets are off, maybe. I don't know. I'm terrible at saying.
Me too. I always say I would lose that category in like Jeopardy, like anything, anything that's like expressions like from this country. I don't know.
Yeah. And I think this is a really important question, because I know that when things have happened, when the string of like the next African-American man has been shot down by the police, and the next, or here in our neighborhoods, like young Latino men, it's like when to break it to my two sons that this has happened, and how to shelter, how not to shelter. All those are really important questions. And so I actually was very grateful when a young man, Alex Nieto, was terribly assassinated here in our community, for the fact that the teachers took it on and made space to talk about it, and almost took that burden off of me for a minute as I kind of dealt with my own grief. So I think that in some ways, the teachers can be really strong partners in tackling those important issues, giving parents an entryway. So, yeah. I will say one other thing about the process in terms of the collective is that, as entrenched as I am in the mission, and as much as this story was very influenced by a lot of things that I've experienced or I see, I really appreciated the ask and the challenge to make this a story that could be anywhere. And that was a really beautiful thing, was really to just sort of say somebody in the Midwest or someone in the East Coast will be able to resonate with the story. That was really powerful for me.
Thank you for sharing that, Leticia. Luz, did you want to now talk a little bit about, making this connection and ways that teachers can think about approaching this topic? How do we plan around it? There's so many ways that we use books in our classrooms. So
absolutely. And I just want to thank you, Leticia, for mentioning how you felt like this kind of a bit of a weight off of yourself as you were processing this horrible news, right? That teachers were able to actually engage your own children or your child, right, in this conversation around what was happening. And I think that's something that we talk a lot about in our work with teachers and future teachers, Carla and I, about how we can't expect to be, we can't decontextualize anything that we do in the classroom. We have to be able to be aware of what the community is grappling with, what the children's families are grappling with, and create those spaces in the classroom for children to have a space to process. Often schooling can be seen as completely separate from children's and community lives. And so part of our work is making sure that educators can see, and future educators can see, those connections and the importance of making those explicit connections and those spaces in the classroom. So thank you so much for adding that. That really is really helpful.
And Luz, I forgot to mention, I just wanted to transition to everything you're going to share. But if you could just share a little bit of where you're at, where you do this work with teachers.
Yeah, so I'm currently an assistant professor of teacher education at California State University at Fresno. And I'm also the professor in residence for a bilingual teacher residency program. So we prepare future bilingual teachers, future general education teachers, and just education leaders through our master's programs as well. So that's my current role. But I also, along with Carla, we're thought partners for many school districts and organizations around how to center bilingual children, bilingual children's identities and language practices, ways of being. And that's really, I mean, this book that you all created is just a beautiful example of, the ways that we can, well, hopefully use this book, right, to support teachers and doing really meaningful work with young people. Do you want to share some of the, yeah, great, thank you. We want to see a bit of a visual. So a lot of the work that we do with educators or future educators is consider ways to imagine how to approach instruction or the planning of teaching and learning, right? And so in our book, in Comunidad, Carla and I developed this framework that we call the 3 T's: topics, text, and translanguaging. And when we talk about topics, we want future teachers to think about, well, what are the topics that are culturally and linguistically sustaining, right, to the community, to the students that you teach? What are the, like I said before, what are the topics or the issues the community is grappling with? How can you address that in your context? And the second T is for texts. What are the texts that are in solidarity, right, with students' identities and ways of being, language practices? The texts that will support the learning of the topics, right? And finally, translanguaging. How do we center and honor the dynamic, fluid language practices that are always present when we teach bilingual, multilingual children? And I love that Alexandria is a bilingual text, right? So that we can, that is a way that we could support translanguaging as well. When children are bilingual, multilingual, when they have access to a bilingual text like this, right? They can make connections. They can understand the concepts a little bit more deeply. There's so many different possibilities that a bilingual text like this can offer. So translanguaging, just really honoring students' dynamic language practices. So in our book, we also talk about reading in community, which is kind of a reimagined version of the traditional read aloud.
So I started my teaching journey as a bilingual teacher in Harlem, in New York. I was teaching 6th graders who were in a bilingual program in the school. And what I realized is that all the professional development sessions I went to, or professional support that I got at my school, all the curriculum that told me like how to teach, it was all very teacher-centered, right? And what my students taught me is that they want to participate more. So they also want to be part of, engaging in conversations more and reading together, as opposed to always listening to me read, them just listen and have these short amount of times where they process and talk. And so I had this beautiful opportunity in writing with Luz and thinking about how can we reimagine and switch up our teaching, if we could be more intentional about the books that we choose, one. So here we have Alejandria Fights Back, and thinking about places where we can pause and really consider ways that students can read with us. So I can read, I'm going to pause, I'm going to project on the screen this page, or I'm going to make copies, or somehow you're going to all have a visual that we'll read together. This book lends itself to so many places because we have amazing dialogue between Alejandria and the family. And we have these really intense moments where Alejandria is learning about her family and her family history. And also Alejandria is picking up on the clues of how her mom is feeling about what is happening, how her grandmother's feeling about what is happening, how Tita's feeling. So I feel like those moments are great for students to read and take different roles and practice. And for those learning English, it's great. For those learning Spanish, it's great because you have the Spanish and English in the book. It's also great for the teachers who are like, I love teaching reading strategies and I want to do my, nice cute chart, which says like readers will analyze characters by paying attention to character reactions. Great. Do your teacher thing, do your cute anchor chart, and then go to Alejandria Fights Back, and you can teach students and say, oh, I'm going to read, I'm going to pause here. Notice, the characters' reactions. Notice that there's a pattern. Something keeps coming up. Something happened in Alejandria's family before. Something's happening to Alejandria. Something's happening in the neighborhood to her best friend. When we see things that repeat, we notice that there might be a theme there. right? So you can do all your like lovely teacher anchor charts and pause in these different moments and plan with that. So for me, it's been really exciting to read this book several times, because besides having been a middle grade teacher, a bilingual middle grade teacher, I now teach middle grade in the summer in a summer program at an independent school in New York. And so I'm always planning ways that I read text and reread. And I'm also at a teacher preparation program like Luz, but unlike Luz, who's in West Coast, I'm in New York. And I've done a lot of work with planning these reading and community experiences. So I'm just excited that all of you will be able to plan this way too. And I think that also takes us to the final thing that we'll share about ways that teachers can take this text to say, this story can be in conversation with other stories, right? So what other books are your favorite books, recent books that can contribute to teaching around a topic like your community, and what do you notice in your community, whether its community is changing because it's being threatened by different forces, like in We Are Water Protectors. Oh, I wish I would have put the image with the Caldecott medal. I missed that part. But it's, you know, award-winning book too. Maybe family learning about stories that we learn about our community and our views of the community. So in Milo Imagines the World, right? Milo's on his subway ride and has observations about what he sees about people and ideas about people, and then revisits those ideas. And I think that's a powerful thing we can do with Alejandria Fights Back as well, right? Like revisit our ideas about, and I think Mike, you said this beautifully about shame that come, or how people are made to feel ashamed about what's happening, versus the different narrative of what does it sound like, feel like to stand up and to speak your voice into existence and your reality and to make that known, right? And so for me, it's been really exciting to reread this text, because again, I was like middle grade bilingual teacher. I'm like, yes, I got to use this. My middle grade books, I would still use this with, if I'm middle grade teachings. I'm a big believer in picture books should be in every school, not just elementary school. Like picture books should be everywhere. But also I got to translate the story. So that's another part. That's where I fit in here. I forgot to mention that earlier. So I had to reread a lot. And that takes me to that last part, is that you can consider looking at issues of the topics in the text, but also look at the ways that the words are chosen in the text. And Leticia and the whole team that worked on this book, like, we're so intentional about the descriptions of the community. And so for me, that's something I do this a lot with my teachers in my teacher program. Luz, is this a thing? I feel like this is a thing in like a lot of teacher programs where I hope it's a thing, where you do a community study. Like you're asked as an assignment, right? Like get to know the community where you're going to teach.
Absolutely. That's
Yeah.
definitely one of the
I know,
major
I was like,
assignments.
I know Margot does this. I don't know other people, but
A community study, and
I hope everyone does.
also, yeah, of course, like inquiry projects based on like a specific focal student, things like that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So how beautiful would this be if everyone, not just the students, but also everyone who works within a school, everyone who, when you take your students to your public library, librarians working with the students, I think it would be really beautiful to engage in a little community study and what are our observations, and who are the people that, you know, are people in the community that just make us feel loved. And I think that's what we get a lot in the beginning of the story. I can't tell you more because I know you all have like access to just like the first 3 or 4 pages publicly on this book, but I think that's a place where we can start. So obviously a lot of things that we can engage with this book in our educational settings. And so we have just a few more minutes, and 5 minutes just to wrap up. I thought it'd be great if anybody wanted to share other resources, or whether it's an organization, another book, a song, a film, anything that you would put into conversation with Alejandria Fights Back. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I have one. You were just making me think about a story that I read to my son when he was little. He's much older now, but when he was a baby, there was a story called La Calle es Libre. And I can't remember if it was in Portuguese.
The streets are free.
Yeah. Or English first, but I remember they lived in like almost like favela or something. Yeah, and they wanted a park. The kids wanted a park, and they basically had to like get their community together to build this park. And I really love that story, like the power of community. So yeah, I love that one.
You know, that was like one of the favorite books of my sixth graders. I had that book in my sixth grade classroom. I got so many memories. So The Streets
Awesome.
Are Free, La Calle es Libre, another book that we can put into conversation with this book. Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, and definitely Si Se Puede, Yes We Can, which is about the successful janitor strike, which I had actually not read for a while, but someone reminded me about it. I think in our conversations when we were talking to presses, and I see a lot of connection here. I mean, while it's the mother and the adults that are leading the sort of like fight, the youth have a role as well. It would be awesome in conversation with Alejandria.
Yes, and that's also another bilingual book too.
Yes. Okay, also this is kind of iffy, but also I like to be iffy. So vampires versus the Bronx. Like, okay.
Okay, look at you being very multimedia here.
So yeah.
I mean, they're kids in the movie who are leading the fight against the gentrifying vampire, you know, whole thing. And so that might be interesting. Maybe it's a way. I totally agree with you about the all age thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm still buying children's books, and my oldest is 11 and not really reading them as much, but yeah, it's a great movie. It just warms my heart.
I can't wait. I want to write this unit right now. Okay. And if we can get Mike again, what's the name of your organization? While we're wrapping up, I'm going to put the visual so people know where to find all of us.
Yeah, if you're in the Boston area, City Life Vida Urbana. If you're not in the Boston area, we're part of a national coalition called Right to the City Alliance. You can look up your local organization there. Of course, sign up on there's risehomestories.com if you want to keep track of all the different projects that are being assembled by this really amazing tag team effort of organizers and storytellers. And of course, you can still follow us on social media at Rise Home Stories.
All right, I'm going to share the screen now. I didn't want to be distracting because you know that's really awkward when you get the share screen on that Zoom Live. So here we go. Here's all our information. And this is where you can find us. So Leticia, anywhere else besides Twitter? I just put your Twitter, but is that the best place?
I don't actually use that mainly. I've tried, but I'm not very good at it. I think I just go out and see like what's Rob doing right now. But I mean, I have a website. I'm transitioning it right now, but I can still put joinleticia.com.
Thank you. Joinleticia.com. Rob, is this good for you? I know, Rob, you got several places we can find you.
Yeah, Rob Don't Stop is good. And then you can find all the social media through there, robdon'tstop.com.
And Mike, we have your City Life organization right there on Twitter. And Luz, I didn't put, I know you're good on Instagram. Sorry, I missed it. I was trying to fit everything on this slide.
No, yeah, definitely on Twitter and through the website as well. But thank you all for, being in conversation, with each other and letting us just, enjoy your book too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.